This is the Change Physician, episode 162. Yeah. Well, no, I guess I'll start it. Welcome to the Change Physician. I'm Melissa Cady, the Challenge Doctor, with my co-host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro. And as you can tell, we're a little stressed at the beginning of this because we're trying to figure out who was going to start the episode. A little miscommunication there. But speaking of stress, this is something that Kevin Cuccaro, my co-host, has been pretty passionate about and very instructive, not want to say instructive, but very passionate about teaching people about stress. And I think he and I have both experienced it, and we're human. So I think a lot of people,
everybody's experienced it.
Yeah, to some extent. But I think a framework for how to understand it, the reason we said stressed out, ? Or I assume that's what our title will be, is I think it's good to kind of dive a little deeper. And I think it would be great to hear your take or your framework or how you think is the best way to kind of look at stress and explain it to people so maybe they can better deal with it. Maybe. What do you think?
Well, that's the goal, right? Better to better deal with it. And I do hate the word stress management. We're going to use that just because that's the typical thing. And I don't like dealing with things because it implies it's so reactive, right? And that all reflects like this. This was a huge journey for me, is understanding stress. Yeah. And so much about like medicine, we jump to the how-to. Oh, you're stressed out. This is what you need to do. Well, why do you need to do it?
Yeah. And
this kind of returns, and I think we've brought it up in different episodes about the idea of really understanding the problem. Actually, we talked about this with Bill Lear, like first principles, like what do you understand? What is the foundational knowledge of what is true? And that came for me for stress because, like we've talked about in the pain journey, I'll talk about effective stress management, chronic pain, stress management. And I'm like, okay, why? What's the importance there of stress management? Why would this, if you're thinking of pain in this sequential cause and effect fashion, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But more and more, we were kept seeing this, well, stress management. And so I spent a lot of time learning about stress and looking at the literature about it, and then looking at how the different interventions work. And ultimately kind of came up with this way to visualize it and to kind of work through it and to make sense of the interventions that people recommend when you're talking about, are you stressed or not? So first we got to start with the definition. So I just had a little rant on one of our Saturday salutations about the importance of definitions. What definitions do is they profound some boundaries so that we can actually appropriately define what it is and what it is that we're not talking about. So the two key ones for stress are stress and stressor. So what is stress? Stress is basically a response. It's a physiological response to a stressor. So oftentimes what we say when we're stressed out, or we talk about this is making me so stressed, is we're really talking about we blur the two together. Stressors are the things that are occurring in our lives, and then stress is the reaction that we have to it. Stress has both a psychological and a physiological component to it, right? This whole idea of mind or mental and physical being completely separate, we know doesn't make any sense, because when you see a lion, your heart rate's going to go up, which is a physiological response. That perception is really the mental related aspect to it. So you can't take the two of them apart. So when we know that stress is the response, and then we know that stressors are the initiators or that participate in that, then we want to look at, well, why do we have that response? Well, the stress response keeps you alive. And we were all told this in medical school. You have a sympathetic and a parasympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system being sort of the fight, flight, or freeze, which is the thing that gets initiated when we see the tiger or we hear the loud noise, and it prepares our body for physiologic action, both mentally and physically. And then we have the parasympathetic nervous system, which is involved with backing off, that rest, relaxation, recovering aspect to it. And so our bodies are in this constant flux between the two. And so when I think about stress, though, is that you look at stress and then you go, well, why does that stress response get initiated? And it's going to get initiated either through something that occurred to your body. So when we say, if you fall down and break a leg, you are going to have a stress response associated with that. If you see the tiger, again, now they haven't bitten you or anything, now we're also going to have a stress response. The triggers are a little bit different. Then when we think about why, when we get stressed, so why is, if this is so awful and we're running around saying we're stressed out all the time, you know, then what's the purpose of stress? Well, the purpose of stress is really to drive action. It's to prepare you and allow you to perform actions in such a way that you can survive. So stress and that stress response is all about survival. And that survival element to it is all about short-term survival, not necessarily long-term survival. You know, our brains are still acting like we're running around on the Serengeti 2 million years ago. And so that short-term survival is involved with making your heart rate go up. It's going to shunt blood to your big old muscle groups. It's going to actually narrow your focus of vision so that you're, shouldn't say narrow. It's going to actually heighten your perception to other threatening stimuli. And it's going to shunt blood away from things like your intestinal tract, your reproductive organs, and things like that. That's a long way to say is, if you are getting stressed all the time and you have that acute stress response, you're going to start seeing problems that are associated with either the physiologic effects of not being able to turn down that threat sensitivity in your brain, or you're going to start seeing problems happen around all the organ systems that are involved with your stress response, which cause your GI. So, what happens when you get stressed? Well, you want to either pee or poop, whatever's out of there, or sometimes your bowels will lock up, right? Because it slows down digestion in the upper GI, and it wants to expel things in lower. So you may get intermittent diarrhea and constipation. If you have to, it may make you feel like you want to pee. Like, I always go back to a cat I had that got in a fight and peed all over itself. And it was like, what is going on? Oh, my cat was totally stressed out. You may get palpitations and chest pain and things like that are associated with stress. And once you start being able to tie these triggers together, you can then be able to really see just how stressed out you are. You're just like nodding your head. I know I've been talking for a long time.
No, I know. I agree with all of it. Yeah,
So,
okay. It made me think of Hans Selye. How do you say it? Yeah.
Yeah, way back. Who there's Cannon and Selye had the stress, with a lot of stress literature. Walter Cannon, who was at Harvard, actually did the first sort of studies on it. Selye was looking at things in really a cause and effect fashion, and he did something, and I can't remember off the top of my head. You know, science, this is totally off topic here, but science is really good about eating people when they make a mistake. So Selye had really interesting observations, had some good data, and then I can't remember what he did, but he basically put forth a wrong hypothesis. And if I'm remembering the story correctly, that's why he never won the Nobel Prize, because it was completely wrong. Anyway, so but we kind of throw out the baby with the bathwater with these people. Canada didn't have as much of an issue, but anyway. So stress is something like when people say, I wish I had no stress in my life. Well, you don't want that because you would die. You know, little stresses are things challenge. Like, hunger. You can little teeny stresses, like these little stressors that get you to take a little bit of action, gets you out of the house to do things that would get you actually to go and chase down the deer, to fight off the intruders or whatever. So we want stress in our lives. In fact, the absence of stress can be as detrimental as having too much stress in your life. Yeah. I use an analogy of a boat when it comes to stress. And so the boat comes down to the boat itself is your physical body. On that boat, you have the crew, which are the processes that are involved with making sure that your muscles move, that you're well trained, that you can follow through with your actions. And then finally, you have the captain. And the captain's sort of like your brain, who's looking out over everything and guides everything. Each one of those pieces of you as an entity, this boat floating around, has really important contributions to making sure your boat navigates the world effectively. So then you have your boat is floating on this ocean, and that ocean is basically life. And then stressors are all the things that can impact that boat: the wind, the waves, the waters, other boats, rocks in the things like this. So all those things, whale sharks, all those things, although most of those shouldn't really impact your boat too much. They may impact your crew, right? And which would be a stressor if you're swimming through shark infested waters and your crew sees that. May actually pose no risk to the boat itself, but be terrifying to the crew because now they may actually not climb up the rigging because they're scared of falling in the water. So we have the boat floating through the ocean. The ocean is life. The winds, the water, and the waves is the stressors. How do we get that boat to then navigate it effectively? Well, you want to make sure you keep your boat up. So you want to make sure it's well prepared. How do we do that? We eat foods that are good and nutritious. We exercise. That exercise is actually building your muscles and your ligaments and tissues so that they're all firm, so your boat is strong. In addition to that, though, your crew, those processes involved also be well honed, and they need that captain who can kind of see and navigate things effectively. So you want a captain who can look out on the horizon and anticipate if there's a storm coming and get the crew ready to prepare, maybe batten down the hatches or get down your sails. In the same standpoint, though, if the captain can't be looking so far out all the time that he neglects the day-to-day action of making you being able to navigate the islands or wherever you are so that you can get to where you want to go.
Yeah.
And then when we look at stressors, so you're on your little boat, we can have stressors of three major types. We have stressors that are just overwhelming physical stressors. So you have a big hurricane that comes in. That's an overwhelming physical stressor. We have the stressor that's related to the captain when he's maybe thinking and worrying about things or not. Like maybe he looks at the cloud and he thinks, oh, that's a hurricane, but it's actually not a hurricane. It's just a little small cloud. Or maybe he's minimizing it and saying, well, that's just a little small cloud, so he's not preparing. So there's the perceptual ones. And then you have the training of and then you have the crew themselves need to have time to rest. So if your boat is doing this all the time and the crew can't sleep and they can't rest and recover, then the crew gets tired, the boat starts to fall down. So you have stressors of perception, you have stressors of recovery when you haven't had enough time built in to rest, recover, and relax. And you have stressors related to ability. The size of the ship and your crew themselves just simply cannot deal with the stressor. So if we kind of look at stress in that way, that also provides three areas of intervention: perception, recovery, and ability.
Mm-hmm.
Recovery is the one that always gets widely kind of touted. Those are the things like deep breathing exercises, or they tell you to go meditate or go do yoga and those things. Most of those are not things that you would do in an acute stressful event. And they're designed to sort of pull in that rest, relaxation, recovery, the parasympathetic nervous system and get it down. Mm-hmm. But if you haven't actually dealt with any of the other kind of stressors in your life, it's totally reactive. And that's the thing that just pisses me off. Like when you have healthcare systems and high levels of physician burnout and they're saying, go do yoga, they're not addressing the causes.
Yeah.
You can do all the recovery all you want, but if your ship is just getting assailed every time that you start to, try to do something, you're not actually going to do any sort of long-term benefit with it.
Yeah.
The other ones.
Oh, no, sorry. I was saying people are going to dread going to work.
They're going to dread doing the work. And so you actually have to, if your boat is floating around on the sea that's stormy and there's this, crazy stuff's happening and other boats are coming by, we'll call them administrators, and they're throwing stuff at your boat and they're trying to grab your sails and pull out your sails or grab your sustenance. And so you can't feed your crew. The thing that you need to do is sail away from those basically pirate administrators and get to a calmer sea. Right.
That's right.
And then you can do your rest and recovery as well in addition to it. But really, you got to change that environment in order to
become your own boss.
Yeah,
one option.
Otherwise, your boat is just going to get beaten down all the time. You can have, crew going to sleep and doing yoga poses on the deck, and then as soon as they stop, they're just going to get pounded by, I just like that, pirate administrators. Pirate administrators, and it's not just it could be pirate, a lot of different people.
Yeah.
So the key one, like the major driver though, is the captain, and it's what the captain sees. So when you have a stress response, there's two major types. There's like the cortisol driven, and then there's the more epinephrine driven. Cortisol driven is when your brain sees something and goes, oh crap, I don't know if I can recover from this. There's like a tidal wave coming, or there's a big storm coming, or whatever. And what that happens when you have that cortisol release is you get lots of, blood glucose. So you have energy to do it, but it also starts getting your immune system riled up because it's like there's not much I can do. I'm going to get hurt. So I need to make sure that my body is able to repair itself. And it's that cortisol over time that's really the bad kind of side. That's the bad stress. We'll call that distress, threat perceived stress. That's associated with long-term, or I should say, the worst kind of long-term outcomes when it comes to stress, accelerated heart disease and things. The eustress, the good related stress, is what we call challenge related stress. That is more driven by the epinephrine and norepinephrine. So there's a little bit more of that, not as much cortisol secreted. There's still cortisol, but less of it. And those are shorter on and off. And that's the stuff that if you are an athlete or you're challenging yourself or you're doing those day-to-day activities, and it's kind of pushing up to the point of, well, I'm not, you don't want it so easy, because if it's so easy and there's no stress involved, you're actually not training yourself at all. You want it to the point of, I'm not sure if I can do this, but I think I might be able to. I have the skills, the resiliency and everything else that I can do that. And so when you do that, now you're actually going into a more eustress, that norepinephrine, epinephrine type of stress backs off, and actually training your body to respond appropriately. Mm-hmm. So same way as you're doing exercise, that's sort of like the same way that you can exercise stress, is that perceptual shift. Mm-hmm. And then finally, we talk about perception, we talk about recovery, and then lastly is ability. And ability is basically, if you think about it in the same way, like hypertrophy of a muscle. You challenge it, you back off and rest in response, the muscle grows and gets stronger, so that future challenges are not as overwhelming as they were before. So like when you're looking at stress from a healthcare standpoint, the things to do is, okay, well, what are the stressors in my environment? How am I seeing those stressors? And then basically is, how are you challenging yourself so that you build your muscles? And how are you providing enough relaxation or kind of renewal time so that you can build up your stress muscles? The biggest lever is that perceptual element. And this is one of the reasons way back when we were talking about doing the change physician, that's why I was really interested in this, because when you are a physician and you're sitting there going, there's nothing I can do, my practice is so horrible, the hospital administrators are so bad, you're amplifying your stress because you're seeing all that as a threat, not as a challenge, which increased that sort of distress response. Versus recognizing is, yeah, a lot of health, not all of them, but many of them, hospital administrators suck. Most healthcare systems are kind of crappy. Most environments, particularly in the COVID area, are really, really challenging. But if you see them as this awful thing, you're going to make it worse. The challenge is to say, well, how do I flip the switch here and recognize, well, this is a challenge. How do I appropriately face this challenge? And in some situations that may be, well, what do I need to do to leave this position? What do I need to do to identify and get to a different environment so I'm not in the same environment? It's making sure that you have choices and recognizing the appropriate with the choices that you have.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was thinking about how it just made me think of how many people out there, I think, because of this pandemic, have rethought and realized when they had a moment of not doing the day-to-day that they almost normalized the stress, which is another topic we could talk about. But when they finally were able to maybe go back or maybe rethink about what they started feeling, this sense of doom or stress of having to go back to that environment, or recognizing when they did go back, it was god awful. And it's like a switch went on, and the light bulb went on. And so they realize they need to do locums. There's so many people now doing locums, not only because I think of that, but because the pay rate's so much better for a lot of nurses and physicians. But I think it's an interesting concept when you think about how people are recreating an environment by just changing from an employee mindset to a locums kind of mindset. So I think that's where some shifting has happened recently, which could have some bad consequences down the road from a cost in our healthcare system. It's already having a hard time managing. But
well, and that's, you ultimately, you would prefer to be able to make proactive decisions rather than reactive decisions when you're overwhelmed. It's sort of like the same way as, and unfortunately, this is really hard for most of us, is humans can tolerate a large degree of misery.
Yes.
Without changing.
Yeah.
Tim Ferriss had I wish I could remember the full quote, but it really was talk about the comfort of misery, because misery is known. There's no uncertainty. If you're in, you can tolerate a high degree of just misery because it's known misery.
But sometimes, and I'll say this from personal experience, you don't think you're miserable.
You haven't had a chance to reflect, right? And you're just sort of doing it, and you're not aware. There's an awareness thing that comes up again. Is you're just sort of, your boat is basically barely above water, and you can't tell that there's any difference, right? You're just kind of going through, and you're just like, oh, my boat's going through the ocean. This just sucks. There's rocks everywhere. The pirates keep grabbing stuff off of me. What you need to do is, if in that brief moment of time that boat gets into some safe waters, and maybe it's not so waterlogged that it lifts up, because you're not going to be sinking in every moment. And then you're in the crow's nest and you look around like, whoa, that ship over there is doing some nice things. This doesn't look so crappy. And maybe I need to steer my boat over there. So it's really developing that sense of awareness, and that's the other aspect of the change position that's so important, is making sure that you are aware there are other options that you have.
Yeah. Agreed.
So, I kind of lost where
I interrupted you.
Well, yeah. But it came down to this kind of perceptual shift, right? And this idea of taking control. So the other, when you're looking at perception again, so awareness that you have choices, that there's other things that you can do, a sense of control. One of the things that, about locums is you are in control. You decide where you want to go. You decide how long you want to work. You just, and you have a pretty strict contract. I haven't done locums, but my understanding
negotiate rates.
You negotiate rates. If they say you got to come in on a Saturday, and you're like, that's not in my contract, you don't come in on a Saturday. So you're returning a sense of control.
Yeah.
Perceived control is huge for stress management. Perceived control, not real control.
Yeah.
So and that comes down to that kind of choice framework again, is recognizing if you are in that, if you have awareness that you are in a not ideal environment, that things aren't the way you want, that's an active choice that you're making to go in there, it will still be stressful, but it will now be a choice, which means it's not a threat anymore. It's a challenge that you have to kind of overcome. So yes, there's going to be stress, but it's significantly less.
Yes.
And, so what you want to do is you want to kind of learn the fundamentals of stress, and like this perception element, how to pull in these recovery strategies, how you can challenge yourself to grow your ability to basically face new stressors, right? That you're, I'll talk about that in 1 second here, but the more you understand that, the more you can sort of navigate even the day-to-day stressors that you are in now. Like if you are in a job you hate, making sure you realize that you have a choice. And if you don't feel like you have a choice, is to then implement the things that you need to do so that you can have one. If you're like drowning in debt, then you need to figure out, well, how can I reduce my finances? How can I make the choices, in which case I can actually make a decision now where I'm not financially driven? And then recognizing what a real choice is and what isn't. Like there was a post in one of the physician groups that we're in that I'll never forget. And it was somebody was like, oh, my job sucks, everything sucks, da 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 da. And then as soon as people were trying to give them some advice, like, well, maybe, we don't have any money, we have all this debt, da 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 da. Well, maybe you need to sell your house. Well, I can't leave my house because we can't leave this neighborhood. Well, what all other expenses you have? Well, all my kids are in private school. Well, maybe you need to put your kid. No, that's not an option. Well, if you're artificially determining and creating non-choice when there actually is a true choice, it may not be the one that you'd like.
Yeah.
But you remove those things, you're propagating more and more stress. So much of this is people who are deciding they have no choice when they actually do have a choice. They're artificial constraints that they're preventing, but that they're placing on themselves. So that's a super long way to say for this particular episode is when you think about stress, Just imagine that you're a boat, that your body is the boat itself, that you have your, that your heart, your blood vessels, all the little physiological processes is your crew. You have a brain in there that's really the captain. You're sailing through the ocean. In that ocean, you will have multiple stressors. It's just the way of the world, that there are lots of winds and water and waves, but you want to make sure you keep your boat healthy, you keep your crew in practice, and that captain is keeping an eye out and knows, what's a challenge and what's a threat, and really trying to navigate in such a way that you're increasing your challenge-based options rather than seeing everything as a threat and danger that you have to react to.
Yes. Amen. Well, it actually just makes me think of the whole reason I call myself the challenge doctor. It's just building resilience. If you can see things, like you said, eustress versus these major stressors you're speaking of, which you said you're going to touch on, how to face the stressors, or is that what you said?
I totally, there was something it had to do with, ability, or
when you face those stressors?
It had to do with parenting. Yeah, and it had to do with challenge. Like, this actually reflects really much on this challenge aspect. You have to, if you're not challenging yourself, you're not going to grow ability. And
Right.
this comes down to is being somewhat comfortable being uncomfortable, is the term, where you do new things that you are not good at, so that you have an opportunity to fail, so that you can learn from those experiences and you can get better in the future. From a parenting standpoint, people talk about helicoptering. When you helicopter over your kids and you are making all the choices for them, you are not providing them an opportunity to fail.
Yes.
When you're trying to pick them up all the time and not give them a moment, what you're basically doing is you're preventing them from developing their stress muscle, such that when they are no longer in your direct purview anymore, so they go off to school or go off to college, that's when they start having these meltdowns because they haven't developed the skills. So just like we need individually, I think one of the hardest things as a parent is to have an understanding of the appropriateness of what stress is and stress isn't, and making sure that we it's the baby bear technique, just introducing just enough stress that people aren't overwhelmed, or particularly our kids aren't overwhelmed, those challenges in there. And then if things go badly, that we provide them the tool sets that they can back off, rest, recover, and they can grow and learn and build that ability again. And, so much of life is people thinking that we're going to have no threats, or wishing that we're no threats, or trying to do everything that's easy, or eliminating everything that's challenging in our environment. And that simply is not compatible with living. And it's certainly not a way I want to live, because if you get to a point where there's absolutely no challenges, there's no difficulties, there's nothing in your environment, well, now you're just like sitting in the ocean and there's nothing there.
Yeah. That's why I'm so passionate about this whole idea of I mean, there's times where things can be really scary, and I've been through that. And it's not always easy, but there's certain areas I think probably sports, or a physical activity is kind of like the easiest to kind of know that, not for everyone, but it was an area that was easier for me to be like, God, it's amazing what you can do and how you can change your body and how you can get stronger, even if it's uncomfortable. But that's how you build resilience. But I think about, I don't have children, and from almost 50 years, well, not quite 50 yet, but almost.
You're younger than me by a year or two, I think. So
yeah, I mean, I've got 2 or 3 years. But I think there's something to say about, even if you have other expectations of your children, if life is not easy, some people it's harder than others, and your ultimate job is to prepare a child to deal with this world, as hard and as crazy as this world may be. And you can't deliver that within a bubble. It has to be, you can do it in increments and incremental exposure, but it's predominantly what you're saying. But if you want to build resilience in your children, they need to be comfortable with dealing with stress, and not by you handling their stress for them, because that is good, and it doesn't prepare the child, and we're going to have horrible generations to come if they do not learn that.
Well, this can we wrap this right into patient care?
Yes.
If you are trying to fix all of your patient's problems most of which you have no direct control over,
Yeah.
you're going to live in a practice of total frustration.
Yes.
And if you're a patient, and if you believe the doctor is going to fix every little problem that you have, and that you're not going to put any work into it, well, guess what? You're entering a world where, again, you have now you're externalized the sense and control over your health to somebody else who may or not actually have any ability to fundamentally change anything. And now you put yourself in this role of less control, right? So, yeah, it's funny, this stress stuff. It really changed my life. It changed my life as an individual. It changed my life as a physician, and it changed my life as a parent. Because of these principles, like really bringing them down and recognizing how important perception is, threat versus challenge, making sure that we understood what recovery is and when recovery is appropriate and how to do it. And then lastly is that ability. And when you recognize that the only way that you can fundamentally start to master stress is to grow all three of these, so that you can, and ultimately so you can get your boat stronger and your crew better and your captain better by growing that ability through little challenges, totally changed me. I haven't since COVID, obviously, but I love speaking. Like, I love getting on a stage. And that's, supposedly one of those big fears that people have. And I hated it. I hated it. The way that happened to me is when I was deployed, I was voluntold that I would have to do the onboarding medical lecture for when the new people came in. And so every week or 2 weeks, I'd have to get up in front of, it was not that big, it was like 50 people, but I had to give a presentation, and it was super uncomfortable the first time, not as bad the second time. And by the whatever time I was doing it, I'm kind of joking through it, and people were laughing. I'm like, this is kind of fun.
Yeah.
And so you do this stuff that's uncomfortable to you. When I was traveling a lot, when I was sort of doing my entrepreneurial part, I was traveling all these conferences. We've talked about the difference between medical conferences and sort of, I don't know, entrepreneurial conferences, or I don't know any of what you call them, but they're conferences that are not necessarily medically focused.
Yeah.
And I was traveling by myself, and I didn't know anybody. I'm somewhat of an introvert in nature. I know I can get really loud on these podcasts, but I'm not. I'm much more of I'm an ambivert, but I'm more on the introvert side of that aspect of it. And then it's like, well, you have to talk to people. That was super uncomfortable, but you do it, and then you start getting better at it. So, yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I think at some point you expose yourself enough to it. And if you're in the company of people that invited you, or they're supportive, or they're interested or curious, and it's not a conflict kind of situation, it's extraordinarily, I think, especially if people really gain insight. I think it's very rewarding and can be a lot of fun. Yeah, I think for both parties. But yeah, I think I was going to mention public speaking earlier when you were talking about certain stressors. But yeah, I think that's a good example. But I think there's also, I just wanted to reemphasize how we talk about the stress response, or use stress and seeing things as challenges, and reframing or changing the environment. But I also want to just reemphasize how much your overall wellness and health is tied to this, and that we can't overlook just the health benefits for you overall, to try to find ways to capture the eustress that you need to be a resilient person and to grow as an individual, but to be aware of the things that are not beneficial for you, and to whether eliminate or minimize those kind of stressors that are unnecessary.
Totally agree. Yeah, I totally agree. And if you don't think that, basically you can build your stress muscle actively and proactively, or by responding to everything. And the problem with that response sort of oriented thing, like where you just don't really kind of anticipate and understand stress and how things work, that's really easy to get overwhelmed. And it's really easy to get in a scenario where you don't have the stress muscle to kind of overcome it. And that's when you get some really bad health effects. And that's the thing that just kills me. And particularly, we kind of move into the healthcare discussion on this stuff, is almost nobody will say that stress is something that you should minimize. And yet stress in particular distress, this threat-based stress where people have no sense of control, when they don't feel like they have the capability or efficacy to overcome it, when they're environments that are unsupportive, they don't have adequate time to recover. That is like a death sentence, maybe not this today, but over time, it comes down to stress physiology. Well, where does it hit? Well, you get accelerated cardiovascular disease. Why? Because the stress response is integral to the cardiovascular system. You may have GI related disorders. Why? Because the GI system gets impacted by stress. You may have problems with fertility issues. Why? Because the blood gets shunted away from your reproductive organs. And so long-term detrimental effects of that starts causing reproductive issues. You may have skin related issues. Why? Because the skin is one of the largest organs in the body, and there's an immunogenic response with that. It's just crazy. And then so much of what we do in healthcare, when you kind of appreciate stress, if you're a clinician, you can start saying, well, why is my patient coming in with irritable bowel and palpitations and acne and can't get pregnant? Wait a second.
Oh, let's give
are
them
there problems, or is there something else that we need to be looking in this picture here?
Yeah. Got to look at the big picture.
Yeah, definitely.
I think if people really step back and are aware and really think about these things instead of just like, trying to blame the outside world, you got to realize that we are influenced by all these things, our perceptions and what's going on around us. So no better time than now to bring that up, especially in light of these last couple of years.
Yeah, for sure. We've had an optimum environment to practice stress mastery.
Yes.
or to develop our stress muscles. We can either develop them, or we can, get thrown around and have big, large weights thrown at us when we're not ready to carry them.
That's right. Well, do you want me to take us out?
Take us out there, Captain.
All right. Well, thank you for the boat metaphor, Kevin. Quite relevant to all the various factors that are part of stress and our experience, and how we can adapt and change and hopefully create a better environment with more eustress than distress. But thank you for joining us on the Change Physician. And if you don't know what the Change Physician is all about, please go to thechangephysician.com. You can join us in the community, whether you're a physician or a physician ally. We'd love to have you there. Of course, you can find the podcast in all the podcast venues. Check us out on Instagram, where we give you some updates on some releases or anything going on. And of course, occasionally you'll see it some on other social media, whether it's our Facebook page. Of course, you can go there for Saturday or Sunday salutations or special day of the week salutations, and or LinkedIn at times as well. So you can find us all over the internet, and we look forward to seeing the next episode. Take care.
Stay well, folks.